Hey everybody, Cybertal back with you. We're going to start rounding up our examination of how to play against hanging pawns, and then we're going to go into sort of a review phase where we look at concepts and then look at some games that sort of bring all the concepts together. This will be our last example of how to pressure hanging pawns with strictly piece play. Again, to reiterate, you really want to keep the idea of the E-pawn and the B-pawn break in your mind when you're looking at how to pressure hanging pawns, but there are some instances where you can achieve proper pressure with only piece maneuvers. This is a game Josef Dorfman against Dorfman-Romanishin, 1981. Knight f3, Queen's Indian, and now a3. This is the Petrosian variation. We've looked at this in a few games in this series. Just to reiterate what I've said in a few other videos, the move a3 is specifically designed to fight for the square e4. A3 prevents bishop b4, so just an example move. Knight c3 could be met with bishop b4, and this is fine for white. This is sort of a Queen's Indian Nimzo hybrid position that's fairly popular. But in this position, it's harder for white to ever achieve e4 because that bishop is fighting for the e4 square, more or less. So the move a3 prevents bishop b4, which in turn allows knight c3. It allows that knight to go to its most aggressive and natural square in c3 to fight for the e4 square. This game was played in 1981. At that time, the Petrosian variation was a very aggressive and dynamic variation. Now a lot of the venom's been analyzed out of it. The worm has sort of turned back to g3. This has been the main line since Rubinstein came up with it in the 1920s, and it's been the main line ever since. White's still got a lot of juice going in this line. There's a lot of aggressive lines that black has to know well. If I were playing a straight d4 opening and I wanted to play for a win, g3 would be the way to go, but it's just a matter of taste. But a3, perfectly fine. Bishop e7, this is sort of the classical Queen's Indian idea. Bishop a6, it's a little bit more aggressive because it immediately asks white how he's going to defend that pawn on e4. It's more immediately assertive of things, which I sort of personally prefer. One modern mainline, Queen c2 defends, but black immediately drops back to b7, and he seems to be happy with the claim that now the queen can't support a d4, d5 push, which in some positions is important. So one potential mainline. After c5, white can't play d5 here. So that bishop a6 to b7 maneuver, drawing out queen c2, is already paying dividends. One modern mainline. In my opinion, black is pretty comfortable here. White might have a little bit of something just based off his Marici structure. But it's rare for black to have such nice control over d4 and on Marici, or a hedgehog structure. Black is comfortable here. Bishop b7, it's a bit more old-fashioned. Knight c3. d5, this is sort of what black has to choose. a3 prevents bishop b4, so black has to bring more firepower to bear against the e4 square. One modern way, it shocked me how popular this move is, because to my eyes, this is just poor. But in modern chess, it's very popular for black to go for sort of a hippopotamus structure, where he just puts fianchettos both bishops and puts his pawns in a6 and b6 and d6 and e6 and g6 and h6. I'll show you what I mean from this position. So one modern main line. White's just better here, because immediately achieving that e4 push means white's better. This is just a dream position for white, but I'll show you what I mean by the hippopotamus. So let's say this. Let's say h3. Let's say h3 or h6. So the hippopotamus structure are these pawns sort of lined up in like a supercharged hedgehog formation. This isn't a great idea for black because he has such a huge deficit in space. It's basically black's attempt to avoid opening theory and just go for a complicated middle game. The price, though, is that you're going into a complicated middle game with a worse position, and that's usually a poor idea. So g6... just, in my opinion, a bad idea, but grandmasters have played it. It seems like an attempt to get away from modern theory. So keep that in your database if you'd like to, but d5 is simply correct here. CD, ED, knight x d5 is the most popular. sort of a modern main line. And this sort of gets into a style position that you most often see from the semi-Tarrasch. It used to be thought that white had a significant advantage here, just because he has that classical advantage of the d4 and e4 central couplet. Now, black has a lot of options and knowledge of how to defuse this situation. Honestly, white never really gets much from these positions anymore. We know much more about chess, and we know that the pawn couplet on d4 and e4, they're not as scary as they seem to be. But ex-d5, it leaves more pieces on the board, but it puts black at risk of just being slightly worse in a static position. g3, queen a4 check. This is sort of a hyper subtlety. White is trying to draw the black pawn to c6, which he does. This makes the bishop on b7 a little bit worse, because it can't immediately influence the square of e4. Its connection to the square of e4 is completely broken. Also, when black plays c5 later, which he's basically locked into doing, because that's his main pawn break, c6 and then c6 to c5 will be a straight-up tempo loss. The downside for white, of course, this is an investment of time with his queen, so it might not be the greatest investment of time. But I think it's worth it. I think this is an opening subtlety that actually makes a lot of sense. Encouraging c6 is a concession from black. Bishop g2. c5. This is the natural move, but it seems like poor timing. Black is behind in developments. It seems like black should mobilize his pieces properly before shooting for this natural pawn break. So knight bd7 seems better. And then black can just continue mobilization before he breaks up the position. Basically, when you start opening the position, you want to not be behind in development. You want your pieces mobilized so it can properly support an advance. c5 seems risky because black's development is not anywhere close to being complete. Rook d1 makes sense, potentially threatening to take on c5, and then that rook will make a lot of sense in the d-file. a6. This is common in the Queen's Indian. Basically, the knight's going to drop back to c7. It'll help support the d-pawn. It could potentially hop over to e6, where it's nicely centralized. Normal move. I think white's still better here, though. Bishop g5. This would be not the most accurate, because the bishop doesn't really accomplish anything on g5. Bishop f4 is more direct and accurate. This bishop doesn't really have a clear role, but we need to get it developed somewhere to connect the rooks. So bishop f4 is the least harmful role for the bishop, and at least it can potentially trade itself for a knight hopping to c7, where black's hanging pawns would have less support as a result. I'll leave some other things in the notes. One potential way is queen c8. And white's got a nice position, but black is holding for now. This seems like a fair assessment of the position. White's still definitely better, but there's nothing catastrophic just yet. But bishop g5 exposed the bishop a little bit. Knight c7, this is clearly a mistake. h6 immediately gains time from that bishop. That seems clearly best. Bishop f4, if white chooses to take, white's only slightly better here. White's got an optimal setup against the coming hanging pawns, but black has the bishop pair. That seems like a fair result for both sides. Or if the bishop drops back to f4, this is sort of a quasi-forced line. And again, it's sort of a similar evaluation. White's got a knight's position. It's fairly optimal against the hanging pawns, but black is completely solid. There's nothing wrong with this position. But knight c7 is played in the game. This just does not take advantage of the exposed bishop. Take. Knight e5. So this is another good example of how to achieve pressure against hanging pawns with strictly piece maneuvers. Again, to reiterate, and this is something we've looked at the past 3 games, when you start these maneuvers against the hanging pawns, quite frequently, it's going to be maneuvers with your knights that achieves that pressure that you're looking for. The rook's roles are clear. The rooks are going to go to, most likely, the c and the d file. The bishop on g2 is perfectly placed. Right now, the knight on c3 is perfectly placed. It's this knight here that we need to find a proper role for. And knight e5 starts maneuvering, so this knight could hop to d3 to potentially go to f4 to pressure that pawn, or it could go to c4 Now, the black pawn can't take because the bishop on b7 would hang or the queen on d8 would hang. But white needs to get this knight into the game and into a proper place to start attacking these hanging pawns. So knight e5, excellent move. Queen d6, that's a mistake. Just leaving the black queen exposed for no real gain. Queen e8, black wants to get some of the pieces exchanged off to relieve the pressure against his hanging pawns. One potential way of playing this, again to reiterate, in these positions, a lot of times the knight on the rim is actually quite well placed. It has, Tarrasch dictums often break down in these sorts of positions. This is a very nicely placed knight for white, just because it's hitting that c-pawn directly. D8, knight g4, so exploiting that pin. And this is a good place to stop. White is clearly better here. Black's pawn structure is completely demolished. There's not a single pawn that's not either isolated or hanging. But black is holding even material for now. Plus, the simplified nature of the position makes it a little bit harder for white to take advantage of this. So white's certainly better here, and he's playing for 2 results only. But black does have some holding chances. But queen d6 keeps the queen exposed. Knight c4, so gaining even more time, hitting the queen, and heading for a very nice outpost. Queen a6, and then knight a5. It is funny how often, particularly in these hanging pawn structures, Tarrasch's sort of schoolyard dictums break down. We heard all along as we were growing up and learning more about chess that knights on the rim are grim. Well, not always, and especially in these hanging pawn structures, a lot of times a knight on the rim is optimal, because it aims for those crucial squares, either the pawns themselves or the squares around the hanging pawns. Don't pay attention to how a move sort of molds to a saying. Pay attention to what the move does. And here, this knight a5, it hits that valuable bishop on b7. So without that light squared bishop, this bishop on g2 has no opposition. It's just going to scream down the long diagonal, demolishing anything in its path. That alone means knight a5, it's worth its weight. So this is virtually decisive for white. Knight x b7 was played. Bishop b7, bishop f4 is a little bit more accurate. And then e4. Again, we're going over positions where you're achieving pressure strictly with piece play, but you always want to keep these e and the b pawn breaks in your mind. The fact that there's this pin on the rook on d6 here, and d5 is threatened as sort of a mnemonic device to immediately look to the e-pawn break as something valuable. And here it's virtually decisive for white. One example line, I'll just go over this quickly. And white's going to win the c-pawn. The passed a-pawn combined with this incredibly strong bishop on g2 means this is completely winning for white. So bishop f4 was a little bit more accurate, but knight x b7 is perfectly natural. Rook d2, rook a b1 is a little bit more accurate. Again, you want to always keep this b-pawn break in mind, and rook a b1 sort of helps prepare that b-pawn break eventually. Plus, it just flat out defends the pawn on b2 as well. And white has a dream position. He's got the bishop pair. This bishop on g2 has no opposition. But black is holding for now, and that's the important parts. Rook d2, it's not nearly as pressuring. Queen c2. Just a quick aside. It is possible for white to be a bit more direct here. But the fact that these are opposite colored bishops means that this might practically be a little bit harder for white to convert. White is certainly still better here, and I would say much better. But I think white chose the right path forward by deciding to keep that bishop on g5. You don't want to go into opposite color bishop endings when you don't have to, because at least practically, they're much more difficult to convert than different color bishops against each other, or rook endings, or some other type of ending. You want to pay attention to practically what's possible as well as theoretically what's possible. So queen c2 keeps pieces on, much better in my opinion. Knight a4. So again, the knight being on the rim shouldn't bother us because the knight aims at the c-pawn. And it doesn't matter how a move lines up with a schoolyard dictum. It matters what the move actually does. And here, this knight on a4 is pressuring this pawn on c5. That's all that matters. So now the bishop can't take because the pawn would be hanging. So black is forced into taking back with g-pawn. Now, of course, the black's pawn structure is completely demolished. Queen c4. This is the right square, but the wrong piece. b3 is simply better. Now that this c-pawn is adequately defended, this knight on a4 doesn't have to serve a purpose anymore, especially since we've gotten the concession we were looking for. The point of pressuring the hanging pawns with pieces is to try to generate a concession. So here, we've generated that concession. We've gotten black to play d4. Now all of these light squares are completely emaciated. If we put a knight on c4, it would be an eternal piece. There'd be no way for black to ever kick that piece out. So b3 helps blockade the c4 square and gives white a path to get this knight back into the game with knight b2, knight c4. Queen c4, it occupies the hole in c4, but with the wrong sort of piece. The queen isn't the sort of piece you want to be using to occupy outposts. Knights are perfect for outposts, and b3 would start the process of getting the knight to that outpost. Rook d6, bishop d3. It's well placed here. It's aiming at the blockaded light squares, plus aiming at the freshly weakened king side. h4, queen c2 is a little bit more accurate. Again, b3, white really needs to be recirculating this knight back into action. Bishop c4. And black's holding for now, but white has a wonderful position. You know, this knight can come to d3 now, where it's equally well placed. h4 just doesn't accomplish anything just yet. Queen c2, this is actually an outright mistake, and this puts white's advantage in complete jeopardy. Bishop e1's better, just an example variation. Notice here that actually taking an h7 is very dangerous. And suddenly white's completely busted. It's sort of funny how this variation comes basically out of nowhere, and it all has to do with this weakening move of h4. Now here, in this position, you just see the weakness of black's king side, and you think that the winning attack is going to come from white most likely. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, the winning attack comes from black. That's sort of the funny nature of chess, and how its remorseless logic doesn't always square with our desires. But if white plays properly, rook c2, something like this. This is a dream ending for white. I mean, he's never going to lose this, and he's going to win some percentage of the time. But it's opposite colored bishops, and black can just try to hold the dark squares passively. So it's hard to say. I would say winning chances are 50-50. It's going to be 50% white win, 50% draw. But black's never going to win in that game like this. But queen c2 actually puts white's entire advantage in jeopardy. h6. Psychologically, it's very difficult to defend, and psychologically, it's very difficult to transition to the attack after you've had a very passive defensive position for so long. This is the right time for bishop to d6, because that h4 move weakened the g3 square, plus black does have this open g-file, as we saw in the previous variation. It's hard to make that psychological transition from a passive position to active possibilities, but here that's what black absolutely needs to do. Rook b5, and suddenly the fact that this bishop is on h7, black has just enough to take advantage of the tactical weakness that knight on a4. So black's plan is just to play rook a5, take an a4, and then take an h7. And then black would be at least equal in that case. It's hard for white to untangle, actually. If white plays bishop f5, then rook g8, all of a sudden black has very good compensation for the pawn. You know, he's just threatening straight off bishop x g3 and winning. Or knight f4 taking advantage of the pin. All of that's very difficult to prevent suddenly. So white can leave his bishop on h7 for now. He can play h3 or e3. But rook a5, and again, white's simply threatening to take an a4, take an h7. It's hard for white to stop this. Bishop x g3, and this is, I think it's theoretically balanced. This is the final position where I end my analysis because it's far afield from what we were looking at hanging pawn-wise. But I think practically I would take black every day of the week. This exposed white king means that white can never make real progress. But that exposed white king means that black is going to win with some random shenanigans some percent of the time. And plus, white still has this horrible knight on a4 to deal with. The rook on a5 is a little bit of field as well. But black has an immediate threat of taking an a4 and then taking an e4. And it's hard for white to really get by with this knight on a4. So this is black's big opportunity. h6 is just way too passive. And suddenly it passes by again. So bishop c4, the rook is going to come to d3 to help guard the g3 square. So the opportunity for black is passed. King g7, this is a simple error. It's so hard to hold these passive, positionally rotten positions. It's just hard to do. Because there's just so many random tactical threats and weaknesses that you have to keep a hold of that it's hard to keep your mind in the flow of things for that long. Bishop d6 holds everything. It aims at g3, but it mostly allows the queen to come to g7 after taking an e6. Just to show you what I mean. And black holds. But black doesn't do that. Or white just plays rook d3, holds the g3 square. And white's much better, but black is holding for now. Black is keeping everything defended for now. And plus the fact that this knight on a4 is still not involved in the game. Now, if I were white, I'd play b3 here and then try to recirculate the knight into doing something actually useful. But king g7 just allows the game to collapse. And the position's resignable after this, because white's up a pawn, plus black has all of his previous weaknesses. And then knight c5, and then black finally did resign here. The simple tactical point is knight takes e6, and then the fork of the king and the queen. So Romanishin resigned on knight c5, because this is busted. Really the key to the game that I want everyone to look at. This immediate transition to the hanging pawns, this is a favorable hanging pawns, because white is immediately able to gain pressure against the hanging pawns with knight e5. Again, when you're gaining pressure against the hanging pawns with strictly piece play, a lot of times it's going to be these knight maneuvers. Where you put your rooks is fairly clear. You want them lined up against the hanging pawns. Your bishop, this bishop on g2, very clear, aimed up against the d5 pawn. The knights are the pieces that you're going to need to maneuver to get into their optimal spots against the hanging pawns. So knight e5, it unleashes the bishop on g2, but more to the point, it's maneuvering into a better spot to not only attack the hanging pawns directly, but to attack the pieces defending the hanging pawns. So this knight a5 move, this knight looks offside. It's the knight on the rim that Tarrasch warned about. But on a5, it's perfectly placed, because it's attacking this guardian of the d5 pawn. Once that bishop comes off the board, this bishop on g2 is an unchecked monster. There were some ups and downs to the games after that, but really after white eliminated this bishop on b7, the result was never in doubt, because this bishop on g2 is just so strong, and these hanging pawns end up being so weak after d4 is played that white just always has the positional upper hand, and black eventually collapsed, because it's very difficult to defend a position like that. So, model game from Josef Dorfman. Check the game notes, as usual, in the comments, so you can look over the position yourself. Next video, we're going to be moving on to a review. We're going to start looking at some overview games that sort of combine the concepts together, and a couple of games that handle some concepts that we didn't have a chance to look at before, or that don't really neatly fit into one certain category. So, my name is John. I'll see you then.